Chapter 13 discusses the sort of rapid series of events that will lead to the secession of 11 southern states from the United States. Um, they will form the Confederate States of America, and then the Civil War will ensue, right? So this chapter is loaded with tons of specifics and information. I'm going to give you a brief overview as to some of the high points of things that are critical to understanding sort of the coming of the Civil War. When I teach this in class, I always start with what caused the Civil War, and I get a lot of answers, and I go, okay, well, there's really only one correct answer, and that's slavery. Okay, um, the Southern states all said it. They mentioned it in their ordinances of secession. They mentioned it in their speeches when they founded the Confederate States of America. Alexander Stephens says it is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis, the president, also embraces the institution of slavery as being the quote, happiest time for the African American population. But the better question isn't what caused the Civil War. The question is, how did slavery cause the Civil War? Okay. And that's the thing I want you to think about when you go through this chapter, when you do complete your assignments about the Civil War and how slavery, or even why did slavery cause the Civil War, because that's the answer. Okay. The chapter begins by talking about Manifest Destiny, the John O'Sullivan Democratic Press propaganda machine that stated that the United States' destiny was to expand across the continent. And this meant different things to different people, but it essentially was this very patriotic sort of call of manifest destiny to justify the territorial acquisition of land from other countries and other peoples. And if it was the United States' destiny, well, then anybody that was resisting needed to get out of the way. And if they were conquered in battle, if they had their land taken, if they were killed, if they were murdered, if they were forced to assimilate to American ways, that's just the way things are, because you cannot avoid someone or a nation's destiny, right? So we saw Native Americans defeated on the battlefield. We saw Native Americans placed on reservations. We saw Native Americans forced to assimilate via the Dawes Act. You saw the railroad stretch across the continent, bringing white settlers who would claim land via the Homestead Act. You saw the initiating of a war with Mexico over the acquisition of land. And I spoke about the fact that there was a serious issue for the enslavers, that the enslaved were self-emancipating south to Mexico. This became an issue when Texas was a part of Mexico. Texas seceded from Mexico to create their own nation, the Republic of Texas, which was never acknowledged by Mexico, much like the Confederacy was never acknowledged by the United States. Eventually, Texas would be annexed and accepted into the United States, but that was never legit because Mexico never acknowledged that Texas was not a part of Mexico. What legitimized it was a U.S. invasion of Mexico and a subsequent 2-year war in which the Mexican military was annihilated by the superior military forces of the United States, resulting in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which allowed for the United States to acquire half of Mexico's territory. Okay, this included parts of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and it legitimized the acquisition of Texas. Okay, why was this war fought? Why did we pick a fight with Mexico? The answer is simple: land and land for slavery, because the majority of this land that was acquired was south of the Missouri Compromise line at 3630 on the map. This became manifest destiny, and those who opposed the war were somehow unpatriotic or un-American, right? And that's how propaganda works. At the conclusion of the war, it reopened all those different territorial questions about would slavery expand or not? Would the Missouri Compromise hold up or not? And it essentially reopened a lot of the wounds that a lot of people felt had been healed decades earlier by the Missouri Compromise. Ipso facto, this results in a lot of controversy over slavery's extension into the territories and whether or not the federal government has the authority to ban slavery in territories. certainly acknowledged amongst most leading statesmen that the federal government did not have the authority to ban slavery within a state. But what about when that territory was simply a territory and not yet a state? These became the debates in the decade leading up to the Civil War. It would culminate in the Compromise of 1850, which includes many things, including the adoption of California as a free state, et cetera, et cetera. But the most important part of the Compromise 1850 was a strong, federally enforced Fugitive Slave Act. This was the piece that the enslavers had wanted for decades, and this is the piece that they said enabled them to force the North to cooperate in the recapturing of those who had self-emancipated north of the Mason-Dixon line. This law is going to challenge a judicial principle that goes back to English law called the Somerset Principle. Here was the idea legally. If you were an enslaved person, how could you be legally defined as someone's property as a slave if you were in a place, let's just say Ohio, where slavery, the institution, the definition of a human being held as someone's property was illegal? The Somerset Principle said you cannot. And that was the way that the Northern juries and judges and legal system had operated for years, saying, the status changes and we are not forced to assist slave catchers, these bounty hunters, when they come into northern states trying to capture runaways. The Fugitive Slave Law changed that. It challenged the Somerset Principle by saying the status doesn't change. An enslaved person is an enslaved person no matter where they are. And secondly, Northerners are now compelled to cooperate with the recapture of those who have escaped the bonds of slavery. Okay? So a couple of really important things here. First of all, if you were found guilty of assisting with a runaway, there was a $1,000 fine. $1,000 is a lot of money. $1,000 is a tremendous amount of money in 1850. This is 3 times the average earnings of a wage worker, a regular middle class or lower class person. 3 times your annual salary. You were subject to up to 6 months in prison, in a federal prison, if you were found guilty of assisting in the capture in the flight of someone who had self-emancipated. So this drew a line in the sand. Are you willing to risk your own liberty as a white person in the North to assist with those who are self-emancipating? Let me ask it in another way. Do you care enough about slavery to risk your own freedom over it? And this is what got white Northerners upset, is that their own white liberty was now being challenged by the slave power, by the enslavers. They had bullied the government into passing a law that was now infringing upon white liberty. And this is going to start a firestorm of debates over, do you follow laws that you feel are unjust, right? Do you follow the fugitive slave law if you feel that morally it is unjust? And this is something that William Seward, the senator from the state of New York, a leading abolitionist, a man who would become Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, he gave a famous speech in which he said, you follow higher law. You follow the law of God, right? And you don't follow federal laws that are unjust or immoral. Imagine this. You have a federal official, an elected United States senator, giving speeches saying, I'm telling my people to not follow federal laws. So this is where you get that anarchy and that chaos, where Southerners are going, wow, so the North just doesn't have to follow laws they don't like, right? Higher law and just hide behind that. Well, and then this sort of begins this firestorm that will culminate in a tremendous amount of violence throughout the United States before the Civil War. Bleeding Kansas, the caning of Sumner, which was a premeditated assault on the floor of the United States Senate by Southern Congressman Preston Brooks of a Northern abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. Everything's going off the rails, right? The ability to speak civilly on this issue is gone. Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, in which is a true account of the life of the enslaved. Remember, you had this paternalism nonsense that was being spewed out by enslavers Uncle Tom's Cabin was aiming to pull back the curtain on the realities of slavery. It highlighted familial separation through the slave trade. It discussed the sexual assault of these young women who were considered fancies, et cetera, the abuse on plantations, and said, here's slavery. Here's what it really is. Make a choice. Are you for it or are you against it? You can't sit on the fence and be neutral about it anymore. It became the best-selling book of the 19th century in the United States. I mean, let that sink in for a second, right? Best-selling book in the 19th century in the United States. It was popular in Britain. It was turned into plays in the North so that those who were illiterate or those who could not purchase a book would be able to receive its message. And in the South, it was condemned as being basically fake news, right? As we know that this divide, this sectionalism is getting deeper and deeper and deeper, right? You have the enslavers refusing to abide by the Missouri Compromise, saying if slavery is not allowed to follow the flag, if slavery is not allowed in the territories, we will simply not admit Kansas or Nebraska as a state. So what happens? The North, these Northern Democrats, they were called dough faces because they basically were just, the puppets of these enslavers. They had no real principles. They did whatever they were told. They get Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois to propose the Kansas-Nebraska Act, letting those who are settling in these territories vote on whether they want to have slavery or not. Popular sovereignty was the term, right? Democracy, right? Okay, let the people choose. How great is that? This is an event that will stir up emotions within young Abraham Lincoln in Illinois when he had retired from the government and basically was consumed with his law practice and had basically reconciled with himself that his political days were over. When he sees that they're going to allow the enslavers to continue to bully and basically take a minority, 400,000 people in a nation of over 20 million, and allow them to get their way every time, rip up the Missouri Compromise and start over with whatever will suit their needs, he gets back into politics. He starts to give speeches in Peoria in 1854 and slowly will begin his march towards his senatorial run in 1858 against Stephen A. Douglas, right? I think the last thing that I want to talk about here is sort of the arguments for and against slavery as they were made. I've discussed this in other videos, but I want to kind of talk about how the Republican Party that is birthed in the mid-1850s, which is this coalition of conscience Whigs, Northern Democrats who don't want to be dough faces, Free Soilers, the Liberty Party, a degree of know-nothings. They all sort of coalesce under this new political party called the Republicans. Their stance on slavery is simple. Contain it. Do not allow it to spread and put it in its course to extinction. Okay? Kind of like mitigating or sort of like we did during the pandemic, right? If you don't let it spread, it'll die out, right? That was the Republican Party's sort of strategy. That was their stance on slavery. Again, where it exists, the government can't do anything about it. But the government does have the authority back to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and the Articles of Incorporation that the federal government can ban slavery in territories, right? The Southern argument becomes, and this is based primarily in the Dred Scott decision as well, enslaved people are defined as someone's property. This is protected by the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which states Congress shall enact no law, Fifth Amendment, that deprives a person of their life, liberty, or property without due process, meaning court case, evidence, jury trial, etc. That's the due process, right? So if the federal government were to pass a law denying property, slavery as it is wrongly defined at this time, that's in violation of citizens' rights under the Fifth Amendment and the Bill of Rights. And so you really have, especially when the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roger Taney, an Andrew Jackson appointee, an enslaver, a white supremacist, when the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision says any place that denies property ownership without due process is in violation of the Constitution, essentially what the Supreme Court is saying is slavery is now a national institution. It's not sectional, it is national. And anywhere, territories or northern states that denies slavery or denies the right to own slaves is in violation of the United States Constitution.